These experts were of the greatest importance. They were formed into committees at Paris and given problem after problem, especially boundary problems, usually without any indication as to what principles should guide their decisions. The importance of these committees of experts can be seen in the fact that in every case but one where a committee of experts submitted a unanimous report, the Supreme Council accepted its recommendation and incorporated it in the treaty. In cases where the report was not unanimous, the problem was generally resubmitted to the experts for further consideration. The one case where a unanimous report was not accepted was concerned with the Polish corridor, the same issue which had forced the Supreme Council to be cut down to the Council of Four in 1990, and the issue which led to the Second World War 20 years later. In this case, the experts were much harsher on Germany than the final decision of the politicians. The treaty with Germany was made by the Council of Four, assembling the reports of the various committees, fitting the parts together, and ironing out various disagreements. Chief disagreements were over the size and nature of German reparations, the nature of German disarmament, the nature of the League of Nations, and the territorial settlements in 6 specific areas: the Polish corridor, Upper Silesia, the Saar, Fiume, the Rhineland, and Shantung. When the dispute over Fiume reached a peak, Wilson appealed to the Italian people over the heads of the Italian delegation at Paris, in the belief that the people were less nationalistic and more favorable to his idealistic principles than their rather hard-boiled delegation. This appeal was a failure, but the Italian delegation left the conference and returned to Rome in protest against Wilson's action. Thus the Italians were absent from Paris at the time that the German colonial territories were being distributed, and accordingly did not obtain any colonies. Thus Italy failed to obtain compensation in Africa for the French and British gains in territory on that continent, as promised in the Treaty of London of 1915. This disappointment was given by Mussolini as one of the chief justifications for the Italian attack on Ethiopia in 1935. The Treaty of Versailles was presented to the plenary conference on May 6, 1919, and to the German delegation the next day. The conference was supposed to accept it without comment, but General Foch, Commander-in-Chief of the French armies and of the Entente forces in the war, made a severe attack on the treaty in regard to its provisions for enforcement. These provisions gave little more than the occupation of the Rhineland and 3 bridgeheads on the right bank of the Rhine as already existed under the armistice of November 11, 1918. According to the treaty, these areas were to be occupied for from 5 to 15 years to enforce a treaty whose substantive provisions required Germany to pay reparations for at least a generation and to remain disarmed forever. Well, I have to interject here. I have to tell you that the last reparations paid by Germany for the First World War were paid off in 2010. Foch insisted that he needed the left bank of the Rhine and the 3 bridgeheads on the right bank for at least 30 years. Clemenceau, as soon as the meeting was over, rebuked Foch for disrupting the harmony of the assembly, but Foch had put his finger on the weakest yet most vital portion of the treaty. The presentation of the text of the treaty to the Germans the next day was no happier. Having received the document, the chief of the German delegation, Foreign Minister Count Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau, who was, by the way, German ambassador to Copenhagen during the war and a great player in the placing of Lenin to Russia, made a long speech in which he protested bitterly against the failure to negotiate and the violation of the pre-armistice commitments. As a deliberate insult to his listeners, he spoke from a seated position. The German delegation sent the victorious powers short notes of detailed criticism during May and exhaustive counter-proposals on May 29th, running to 443 pages of German text. These counter-proposals criticized the treaty, clause by clause, accused the victors of bad faith in violating the 14 points, and offered to accept the League of Nations, the disarmament sections, and reparations of 100,000 million marks if the Allies would withdraw any statement that Germany had alone caused the war and would readmit Germany to the world's markets. Most of the territorial changes were rejected except where they could be shown to be based on self-determination, thus adopting Wilson's point of view. These proposals led to one of the most severe crises of the conference, as Lloyd George, who had been re-elected in December on his promise to the British people to squeeze Germany dry, and had done his share in this direction from December to May, now began to fear that Germany would refuse to sign and adopt a passive resistance, which would require the Allies to use force. Since the British armies were being disbanded, such a need of force would fall largely on the French and would be highly welcome to people like Foch, who favored duress against Germany. Lloyd George was afraid that any occupation of Germany by French armies would lead to complete French hegemony on the continent of Europe, and that those occupation forces might never be withdrawn, having achieved with British connivance what Britain had fought so vigorously to prevent at the time of Louis XIV and Napoleon. In other words, the reduction of Germany's power as a consequence of her defeat was leading Britain back to her old balance of power policies, under which Britain opposed the strongest power on the continent by building up the strength of the second strongest. At the same time, Lloyd George was eager to continue the British demobilization in order to satisfy the British people and to reduce the financial burden on Britain so that the country could balance its budget, deflate, and go back on the gold standard. For these reasons, Lloyd George suggested that the treaty be weakened by reducing the Rhineland occupation from 15 years to 2, that a plebiscite be held in Upper Silesia, which had been given to Poland, that Germany be admitted to the League of Nations at once, and that the reparations burden be reduced. He obtained only the plebiscite in Upper Silesia and certain other disputed areas, Wilson rejecting the other suggestions and upbraiding the Prime Minister for his sudden change of attitude. Accordingly, the Allied answer to the German counter-proposals written by Philip Kerr, later Lord Lothian, made only minor modifications in the original terms, chiefly the addition of 5 plebiscites in Upper Silesia, Allenstein, Marienwerder, North Schleswig, and the Saar, of which the last was to be held in 1935, the others immediately. It also accused the Germans of sole guilt in causing the war and of inhuman practices during it, and gave them a 5-day ultimatum for signing the treaty as it stood. The German delegation at once returned to Germany and recommended a refusal to sign. The cabinet resigned rather than sign, but a new cabinet was formed of Catholics and Socialists. Both of these groups were fearful that an Allied invasion of Germany would lead to chaos and confusion which would encourage Bolshevism in the East and separatism in the West. They voted to sign if the articles on war guilt and war criminals could be struck from the treaty. When the Allies refused these concessions, the Catholic Centre Party voted 64 to 14 not to sign. At this critical moment, when rejection seemed certain, the High Command of the German Army, through Chief of Staff Wilhelm Groener, ordered the cabinet to sign in order to prevent a military occupation of Germany. On June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination at Sarajevo, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, where the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871, the Treaty of Versailles was signed by all the delegations except the Chinese. The latter refused, in protest against the disposition of the pre-war German concessions in Shantung. The Austrian treaty was signed by a delegation headed by Karl Renner, but only after the victors had rejected a claim that Austria was a succession state rather than a defeated power, and had forced the country to change its name from the newly adopted German Austria to the title Republic of Austria. The new country was forbidden to make any movement toward union with Germany without the approval of the League of Nations. The Treaty of Noe was signed by a single Bulgarian delegate, the Peasants' Party leader Alexander Stamboliski. By this agreement, Bulgaria lost Western Thrace, her outlet on the Aegean, which had been annexed from Turkey in 1912, as well as certain mountain passes in the west which were ceded from Bulgaria to Yugoslavia for strategic reasons. The Treaty of Trianon, signed in 1920, was the most severe of the peace treaties and the most rigidly enforced. For these and other reasons, Hungary was the most active political force for revision of treaties during the period 1924 to 1934, and was encouraged in this attitude by Italy from 1927 to 1934 in the hope that there might be profitable fishing in such troubled waters. Hungary had good reason to be discontented. The fall of the Habsburg dynasty in 1918 and the uprisings of the subject peoples of Hungary like the Poles, Slovaks, Romanians and Croatians brought to power in Budapest a liberal government under Count Michael Károlyi. This government was at once threatened by a Bolshevik uprising under Bela Kun. In order to protect itself, the Károlyi government asked for an Allied occupation force until after the elections, scheduled for April 1919. This request was refused by General Franchet d'Espèrey under the influence of a reactionary Hungarian politician, Count Stephen Bethlen. The Károlyi regime fell before the attacks of Bela Kun and the Romanians in consequence of lack of support from the West. After Bela Kun's reign of red terrorism, which lasted 6 months, March-August 1920, and his flight before a Romanian invasion of Hungary, the reactionaries came to power with Admiral Miklos Horthy as regent and head of the state, 1920 to 1944, and Count Bethlen as prime minister, 1921 to 1931. Count Károlyi, who was pro-Allied, anti-German, pacifist, democratic and liberal, realized that no progress was possible in Hungary without some solution to the agrarian question and the peasant discontent arising from the monopolization of the land. Because the Allies refused to support this program, Hungary fell into the hands of Horthy and Bethlen, who were anti-Allied, pro-German, undemocratic, militaristic, and unprogressive. This group was persuaded to sign the Treaty of Trianon by a trick and afterward repudiated it. Maurice Palaiologos, Secretary General of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but acting on behalf of France's greatest industrialist, Eugène Schneider, made a deal with the Hungarians that if they would sign the Treaty of Trianon as it stood and give Schneider control of the Hungarian state railways, the port of Budapest, and the Hungarian General Credit Bank, which had a stranglehold on Hungarian industry, France would eventually make Hungary one of the mainstays of its anti-German bloc in Eastern Europe, would sign a military convention with Hungary, and would, at a proper time, obtain a drastic revision of the Treaty of Trianon. The Hungarian side of this complex deal was largely carried out, but British and Italian objections to the extension of French economic control into Central Europe disrupted the negotiations and prevented Hungary from obtaining its reward. Paleolog, although forced to resign and be replaced at the Quai d'Orsay, Paleolog, although this was ambassador to Russia before 1917, although forced to resign and replaced at the Quai d'Orsay by the anti-Hungarian and pro-Czech Philippe Berthelot, received his reward from Schneider. He was made a director of Schneider's personal holding company for his Central European interests, the Union Européenne Industrielle et Financière. The Treaty of Sevres with Turkey was the last one made and the only one never ratified. There were three reasons for the delay. One, the uncertainty about the role of the United States, which was expected to accept control of the strait and a mandate for Armenia, thus forming a buffer against Soviet Russia. Two, the instability of the Turkish government, which was threatened by a nationalist uprising led by Mustafa Kemal. And three, the scandal caused by the Bolshevik publication of the secret treaties regarding the Ottoman Empire, since these treaties contrasted so sharply with the expressed war aims of the Allies. The news that the United States refused to participate in the Near East settlement made it possible to draw up a treaty. This was begun by the Supreme Council at its London conference on February 1920 and continued at San Remo in April. It was signed by the Sultan's government on August 20th, 1920, but the nationalists under Mustafa Kemal refused to accept it and set up an insurgent government at Ankara. The Greeks and Italians, with Allied support, invaded Turkey and attempted to force the treaty on the nationalists, but they were much weakened by dissension behind the facade of Entente solidarity. The French believed that greater economic concessions could be obtained from the Kemalist government, while the British felt that richer prospects were to be obtained from the Sultan. In particular, the French were prepared to support the claims of Standard Oil to such concessions, while the British were prepared to support Royal Dutch Shell. The nationalist forces made good use of these dissensions. After buying off the Italians and French with economic concessions, they launched a counter-offensive against the Greeks. Although England came to the rescue of the Greeks, it received no support from the other powers, while the Turks had the support of Soviet Russia. The Turks destroyed the Greeks, burned Smyrna, and came face to face with the British at Chanak. At this critical moment, the Dominions, in answer to Curzon's telegraphed appeal, refused to support a war with Turkey. The Treaty of Sevres, already in tatters, had to be discarded. A new conference at Lausanne in November 1922 produced a moderate and negotiated treaty which was signed by the Kemalist government on July 24, 1923. This act ended, in a formal way, the First World War. It also took a most vital step toward establishing a new Turkey which would serve as a powerful force for peace and stability in the Near East. The decline of Turkey, which had continued for 400 years, was finally ended.